He had always believed that everything held together because he made it hold. Numbers, schedules, discount ladders, cooling cycles, the 5-minute rhythm of cashiers, and the silent marching of pallets on conveyor belts, all of it bent to a precise will he had trained for years. Lev Krutov, the millionaire owner of Krutov Market, did not see people first. He saw throughput. He saw shrinkage and margins and loss prevention. Then one evening, a neighborhood store he owned erupted in a flash that was supposed to be only a controlled failure, the kind that wins an insurance payout and an upgrade. It scorched real skin instead. He watched the footage with the unnatural attention of someone who had once studied engineering and who had taught himself to love any graph that trended upward. He tracked the angle of the flame, the hinge of a display door, the way one relay caught and kicked back. He told himself that no one should have been there, that it had been misfortune, that a small harm for a clean reset was not murder. A young stock clerk burned her hands and face. The security guard took glass in the neck. Strangers panicked under a screaming shutter that did not reopen fast enough. He could tell the broadcast had stretched the sirens to keep the audience angry longer. He kept thinking it anyway. It had worked, the insurer would pay, the old store would be rebuilt. Then the face of the burned clerk returned to his mind and would not leave. He realized the word that had sat under every calculation, acceptable, had become dirt in his mouth. He had not personally wired the relays. He had done something colder. He had authorized a cycle of cheap battery blocks to replace standard units across 20 aging stores, converting safe refrigeration into a short sequence of tolerable risk events. He had told himself that modern retail was a chain of tolerable risks, a precarious balance of prices and speed and wages and technical compromises that kept families fed and investors sweet. He had told himself that the responsibility was too large to feel in full, that if he let every complaint sit in his chest, he would drown. He had signed the memo that accelerated swaps. He had texted procurement at midnight with numbers and targets and 2 euphemisms. He had accessed the fire alarm settings by remote to run a service test that, if he had been braver, he would have canceled. He called that prudence. Later, he recognized a simpler name. He called it fear. When the night ended, he measured the coffee in his kitchen, as he always did, counted the drips through the paper, held the white mug with the small crack in the handle that fit his thumb. He tucked folded receipts into a thick manila envelope, a practice he had kept from the years when he ran a single shop, and feared the tax man more than he feared anything else. He liked the ritual because it pretended to be virtue. He had said to junior managers that verifiability was morality. He had meant that if a thing could be audited, it could be defended. The world had just handed him a different definition. Verifiability had become a trail leading back to his decisions. A partner of his, a man who enjoyed the theater of public rescue, proposed an answer that sounded like smooth efficiency. The answer was to name a culprit at the lower rung, to provide something sharp and emotional for the cameras, to accept indignation at the level of a signature on a local maintenance order, and not at the level of capital allocation. Investors would be reassured by a defined flaw and a human face to carry it. The partner liked stages and liked calling the crowd rational after he had already fed it a story. That path would have worked many times in the past. Lev had used it in softer form himself. He could hear the phrasing of a statement that would absolve the board, preserve the stock price, and promise a bright program of corporate responsibility that included playgrounds and recycling and scholarships. Before the press could be fed anything, a woman who had audited cold storage for him years ago arrived. She did not hold out slogans. She brought papers and data prints and one small drive. Her younger brother had survived the chaos by pulling people out the back and inhaling smoke. She had read the manufacturer's instructions that had been ignored. She had seen the order from procurement that accelerated the cheap blocks and the server logs of alarm configurations. She had already traced one remote session to a reserve laptop registered in his name. She told him none of this as if it were a threat. She described it simply as something that exists. She said the people in the building would not be repaired by the elegance of his next quarterly deck. She named the safety he had traded for speed. He found himself embarrassed by how ordinary the truth sounded. He had spent years perfecting the tone of an underreaction. He discovered his tone worked only until someone nearby refused to collude with it. The company's systems team, who until that morning had idolized his poise, verified what she brought because numbers were still the native language in his world. Timestamps matched logins. Settings at a cluster of stores bore the mark of one session that bypassed one gatekeeper in the name of one authorized test. It could be rewritten. It would always be rewritable, because technology carries that temptation like a permanent gene. Yet here it lay for now, plain. The proof was not elegant. It was not cinematic. It was small, like a bent bracket or a scorched smell you can never air out of fabric. He realized that what would destroy him if it came to it would not be a blockbuster revelation, but a sequence of small, flat facts a patient person could stack in the light. He had planned a briefing for the following day, the kind that keeps the public busy and makes investors feel that competence breathes from the podium. He canceled it. He canceled it because something more interesting than performance had become necessary. He canceled it without fanfare because he had found a different stage. He would hold his reckoning not in front of microphones, not beneath a chandelier, not with a column of cameras framing him from the knees up. He would take it to the only space he had built purely for himself, designed as a private theater of control and taste, a place where he felt sovereign enough to act without witnesses. It was not the office. It was not the villa's grand room. It was the long, narrow wine gallery carved like a quiet artery through stone, lined with salt bricks that trembled in the light, cooled to a constant whisper by a climate system he had tuned with the same determination he gave to a warehouse. He had gone there for years when he needed to decide how much honesty he could afford. On its glass table there was always the same plate with a single almond croissant from the bakery on Rue de la Gaffe in Nice, an echo from the era when a pastry counted as a reward. He had always liked the sound of the crust when the knife went through, and how the flakes fell, sharp as new paper. He had always cleaned them away quickly. That night he noticed the grease circles they left. The surface remained clean only at a distance. Up close the glass was already a map of past indulgences, briefly erased and never confessed. He stared at the circles and thought of the recordings he had made to himself in the remote session, the notes he had left in the margins of contracts, the approval stamps that had felt like responsibility and were a kind of evasion. He had imagined that if he ever had to face something enormous, he would face it in public, with all the old armor and the practiced sentences, as if words that had impressed men who wore lanyards could save a clerk's fingers. The more interesting thing was simpler and crueler. The more interesting thing was to admit fact to self, where self still governed. He approached it unspectacularly. He called his partner and ended the plan that would have fed the crowd a lesser offender. He ended it knowing it would cost him loyalty from someone who understood power only as a market of favors. He instructed the operations team to begin replacements in every store, not through a cautious pilot, but as a rolling wave that would bleed cash like an artery. He told the legal staff to draft a compensation fund that did not nickel and dime, one that treated each injured person as a citizen instead of as a rounding error. He left the office before they could stage an intervention that would talk him out of it. He did not go to a newsroom. He took a detour to the hospital because he had suddenly understood that there are rooms where time dignifies no one, and where words sound like tin unless they carry weight heavier than money. He heard the hiss of oxygen and the shuffle of nurses and the steady sea sound of the ventilation system that pretended to be background but was a lifeline. He understood that he had nothing to offer except a direct admission and the acts that would follow it. He made that admission without drama. He did not write about it on social media. He felt a peculiar clarity like the body makes when it has been holding a breath too long. He left without expecting to be forgiven. He went home by the old bus 100 from Nice to Monaco, not because he had to save, but because earlier in his career he had learned routes by riding them with other bodies and measuring steps to doorways. The bus smelled of diesel and salt. The windows filmed over with spray. The hills slid by with their expensive mute faces. He remembered counting bags, shoes, the stiff knuckles of senior hands gripping rails. He remembered speculating which corners would host stores and how much the trade area would cannibalize from the nearest competitor. He had learned how to see profits then. It embarrassed him that he had not learned how to see injuries with the same clarity. He returned to the wine gallery not to fortify himself with old rituals, but because it had become the most honest room in his life. He realized that to keep his own vow from curdling into performance, he needed to keep pressure on it. He wished for something that would mark him inside that gallery, beyond words. He found it in a place he had not expected, not the expensive bottles, not the salt walls, not the croissant. He found it in sound. He turned off every pleasant noise there, switched off the tasteful hum. He let the villa's deeper mechanical belly be audible. It spoke in uneven pulses he usually suppressed. He forced himself to sit and listen to the breath of the house in full, to the way the refrigerant hissed through coils, to the way the return vents coughed, to the tiny ticks of expansion and contraction in the metal shelves. He realized that the building sounded like the store had sounded an instant before the relay snapped. He realized that this was the most faithful reconstruction he could ever build, a symphony of maintenance he had been trained to ignore. What followed was the opposite of a press conference, which is to say it contained no polished assertion and no appetite to be liked. It was not even a confession to another person. It was an instruction to himself, enforced by an experience he would never forget. He went from the gallery to the logistics hub outside the city while it was still dark and asked no one to accompany him. He knew the guards and the workers would greet him with the wariness people reserve for owners. He understood that he needed not an audience, but a test. He requested that the night shift clear one freezer corridor for maintenance. He walked into the narrow aisle between tall stacks. He asked that the door be closed for the standard 4 minutes a sensor allowed without triggering an alarm. He stood in the cold with the hum pressing into his bones and the metal shelving swallowing sound. Then he instructed the engineer to extend the lock manually to the maximum safe interval and to cut the lights for 10 seconds within that period. He wanted, for the first time, to stand inside a system stripped bare of even the small comforts he had always purchased for himself: light, status, a near door, a witness. The door thudded. The white fell to a darker blue. He counted seconds with professional calm, and then with an animal's panic. Breathing grew sharp. He thought of the relay that threw the spark because he had told the world there was room for the risk. He thought of the stupid advertising lines his team had pursued in bright colors, while a stock clerk organized yogurt pallets under a camera that would later archive her pain. He thought of the way he had trusted himself to remove pressure by adding theater. He thought of the pressure now building inside his chest with no theater to relieve it. He stopped at what he knew was the safe endpoint and then forced himself to wait longer, but not long enough to be a hero, only long enough to feel the edge a little. When the lights came and the door unsealed, he stepped out into the ordinary noise of a warehouse with the taste of cold metal in his mouth and a decision that belonged not to an audience but to the man who had once believed he could rewrite any rule. What was more interesting than a press conference was the irreversible act that followed in that silence. He removed himself from the schedule that controlled everything. He prepared to step down as chairman and surrender operational control to people he trusted as craftsmen rather than performers. He did it before the board could frame it as punishment. He did it because he had learned earlier than they would admit to themselves that he could no longer be the person who signs with one hand and looks away with the other. He arranged the compensation fund and the replacements and the auditor's authority in a way that did not depend on his charisma. He allowed the expense to be public, not as branding, but as a ledger entry that anyone could follow. He did not anticipate gratitude. He anticipated hostility from those who had prospered under the old rules and from those who had waited for him to be ruined. He expected both. He felt underneath the fear a clean track of relief. There were consequences, and none of them dressed in melodrama. Board members demanded formalities. Investors issued demands. Contractors made politely brutal calls to float alternative narratives. He recognized the old system waving him back, offering warm rooms and friendly cameras if he would just agree that nothing fundamental had happened. He declined not as a performer, but as a person who had already stood in the cold and found it instructive. He watched colleagues choose corners. Some stepped away because power to them had always been a pattern of attendance. Others stayed almost shyly, as if surprised by the possibility that keeping one's name could be a form of profit. He visited stores without entourage. He saw where epoxy had been patched and where signage hid an old scorch he would not have noticed before. He found that shame could motivate steady work better than pride ever had. He did not say that aloud. He did not narrate it anywhere people could applaud. He kept going because routines change bodies only by repetition. At home, he adjusted small things because grand changes rarely survive the kitchen. He stopped buying water in plastic. He poured from the tap into the cracked white mug as if honesty had a taste, and it was faintly metallic. He kept his envelope of receipts and saw it differently, not as a badge of control, but as a diary of responsibility. The top one remained the bakery slip from Rue de la Gaffe for 2 croissants and a coffee. He pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet beside a child's drawing of flowers and people with generous hands. The drawing was not a promise. It was not an absolution. It was a marker in a house that had too few. He returned to the wine gallery and left the crumbs on the glass table for a while, instead of brushing them away immediately, as if doing so would degrade him. He would clean them later. He let them sit because he needed to see that beauty had a cost if he pretended it came from nowhere. He looked at the bottles he had once thought of as temporal trophies. They seemed cumbersome and slightly embarrassing, as if they performed a kind of wealth he no longer wished to enact. He realized that taste, when you strip it of pretense, is usually about attention. He had not been paying attention in the right places. He began to reserve that attention for checklists that listed people's names and conditions and payments and dates of follow-up rather than for tasting notes. He met the engineer whose signature had almost been offered to the press as a sacrificial seal. He understood the man's cautious eyes, his posture like a held breath. He arranged to retain him as a consultant for the audit, not to absolve himself, because absolution is not a function of contracts, but because the company needed the truth of what had happened to remain under its roof, as well as outside it. He endured criticism that called this gesture cynical and theatrical. He discovered that doing a thing because it is correct does not inoculate it against misinterpretation. He decided that misinterpretation could not be his primary concern anymore. He made a quiet appointment and went to the station house to give a statement before anyone could script it for him. He went before lawyers could turn the narrative into a chess problem. He had learned to cherish process only when it formed a shield. He learned now to respect it because he had made harm that it could address. He sat in a small room that smelled of coffee and old air and recited facts until the list exhausted itself. The act of recitation did not absolve him. It merely completed the first honest loop he had run since he gave the midnight approval that changed a calculation into an injury. He did not grow instantly virtuous. He did not become a saint of industry. He became, rather, a man who had seen the boundary of what he would accept under his own name, and who would move forward with that boundary visible at all times. He kept his temper shorter and his sentences plainer. He replaced a few executives who could not operate without spin. He retained those who had always cared more about temperature tolerances and forklift maintenance than about storylines. He raised wages in one pilot region not because news cameras hovered, but because the pilot would lower turnover and training hours and accidents, which meant less quiet ruin for families and less mess to wipe from the glass. He learned again to take the bus sometimes, and he listened to the way tired workers called groceries by brand, by weight, by price, by the version of value that mattered at the end of a day. He had once used this knowledge to place promotional islands and adjust assortment. He now used it to check whether the company's corrections were being felt where life actually happens, at checkout, at home, at the dinner table. The partner who loved public rescue continued to call with variations on the same argument. The argument said that optics must be tended like gardens, that doing hard things without narrating them forfeits advantage, that a confession made alone is waste. Lev recognized truth embedded there. He accepted that he had given up a form of power. He understood that some will only ever understand a story if it is told dramatically and often. He chose the other track anyway. He had discovered that interior pressure at a freezer's threshold had taught him more deeply than 10 hours of camera time. He wanted more lessons like that and fewer applause breaks. He began to keep a box near his desk labeled somewhat grandly, Museum of Lies. Into it he placed the folder an intermediary had once tried to hand him at his gate, with the promise that the right confidentiality agreement could sort everything out quietly again. Into it went an old presentation celebrating speed to shelf that hid a page about a supplier's corner cutting. Into it went draft statements that had been crafted to mist over cause with flavors of fate. He kept the box where he could see it. He opened it sometimes to remind himself that he had once found relief in the smell of paper that told tidy untruths. He found that this habit repulsed him now, and the repulsion pleased him because it promised that change had at least begun to seed itself in muscle and not just in mind. The world did not transform to reward him. Profits tightened. A few stores closed. The scholarship program he had once paraded acquired less glossy signage and deeper files. The injury fund swelled and then sank and then had to be topped up again after one of the surgeries extended. Some weeks ended with his head against cool stone while he counted the lives he had touched by forcing a system to reverse a habit. He worried about jobs. He worried about investors who preferred him simple and distant. He worried, most painfully, about whether the burned clerk would ever recognize any difference between the man who had hurt her and the man who had tried to pay for it fully. He learned to live with the fact that she did not owe him that recognition. He learned to live with the idea that accountability does not entitle the accountable to praise. Late in the season, a storm crossed onto the coast and brushed the hills with rain, thick enough to blind. The sea beat against the harbor wall and made a noise that erased finer sounds. In the kitchen he stood with the cracked white mug and watched drops pucker the terrace stone. On the counter sat the envelope of receipts, heavier now with payments to contractors and hospitals and grants that would not make headlines. He slid out the top sheet and read the bakery line, 2 almond croissants and a coffee, and pinned it to the refrigerator beside the drawing. The refrigerator hummed, the house breathed, the world went on. He had learned something that sounded small and old when he said it to himself. Self-respect costs more than gloss, and admitting a personal fault creates the right to demand truth from the powerful only if one keeps paying that cost. It did not erase anything that had happened. It did not heal skin. It did not expunge the log entry he would remember to his last day. It did, however, fix a point he could steer by, a point he had lacked when he had treated human pain as a rounding error. He left the crumbs on the glass table again and walked to the window. The air smelled of salt and wet stone and the faint iron note of tap water cooling in a mug. He saw the reflection of a man who had chosen not to craft his understanding of himself through interviews and applause, but through the stubborn solitude of doing a thing the hard way when no one else demands it. He thought about the freezer, the hum, the 10 seconds of dark. He thought about the bus and the receipts and the childish flowers. He understood that he would face courts and newspapers and people who had reasons to hurt him or to benefit from his fall. He understood that the story would continue without structure and without perfection. He accepted the open end. He turned from the window to the table where the mug waited, and the envelope sat like a modest ledger of a life that would from now on be kept in clearer ink. He took a sip of water that tasted unremarkable and honest. He realized that he had finally stopped pretending. He recognized the sensation not as heroism, but as the humblest freedom he had ever allowed himself.